So I want to note from the outset just the following. Academics are by definition supposed to be experts in some knowledge area, right? And such expertise typically means a research program and a career's worth of work that's defined by narrowness and specificity, right? By depth rather than breadth. And this is often what sets academics apart from public intellectuals, right? A predisposition that spends a little too much time delving into minutiae and as a result sometimes loses sight of bigger picture thinking. And so, when Marty annually reaches out to us to ask us to present at this symposium, my immediate knee-jerk response, given the little tight-knit community in this room, is often, "Oi, what am I going to talk about this year? How do I come up with something new? How do I say something that is not what you've all come to expect of me? How do I not bore you?" And perhaps it's important to note how, what we all do here is as much about us as media as it is a matter of what we have to say, the content, right? Our ideas. I just talked about this with my students during the week I began to write this, as we talked about their ideas for their upcoming papers, right? I told them how I go through on a regular basis exactly what I'm asking them to do, right? It's part of my job. And so Marty wrote to us back in June, "Please give me a title for your presentation this year." Hey, what am I going to write about this time? I think maybe I got lucky. I came up with an idea out of nowhere, out of nothing, that I think maybe has some significance, that has legs. And so let me give it a shot. Hopefully by the end of the 10 minutes I will have developed this idea with the kind of extended argument it deserves, and maybe as a contribution that extends in a significant way the mission and larger subject matter that is general semantics. So, we talk and write a great deal about Korzybski's conception of time binding. How this is a matter of, and I quote here, how we humans adapt to our environment through our awareness and control of space and time. And thus, this is what makes us uniquely human as opposed to the rest of living things, and in particular, all other animals on the planet. Now, I'm not saying anything that anyone in this room doesn't already know when I point out Korzybski's original taxonomy, that plants are energy binders that adapt to their environment through their use and control of energy, that animals are space binders that adapt to their environment through their awareness and control of space, and that the essential part of what defines us as humans is our ability to time bind. This, of course, is not either or thinking. We are humans, all three, though it is time binding that is our supreme achievement and which has helped to make us the dominant species on the planet. But there's another deeply significant way that we humans have become aware of and have been trying to grapple with space. One which has come to, or rather which has been brought to, the forefront of our awareness in important ways in recent years. And by this I mean during the years that cultural studies and critical cultural studies and post-colonial studies have arisen. And that is this: the learning of culture is a matter of space as much as it is a matter of time. It is developed, learned, and extended and enhanced not only over time, and if I can be permitted to use the word in this way, in a vertical way. It is also learned horizontally across space. So let me explain. So I sent my title to Marty, and then I began to think about this, right? And I did what academics do. I went to the literature. I went back to Manhood of Humanity, and I went back to Science and Sanity. And I also discovered an article by Ashley Montagu, published in the Scientific Monthly in 1953, entitled Time Binding and the Concept of Culture. Montagu, who is often considered an anthropologist, is also a deeply important figure in the GS tradition. With William Vogt, he gave the inaugural Alfred Korzybski Memorial Lecture in 1952. He published a groundbreaking book, Man's Most Dangerous Myth, try to say that 3 times fast, The Fallacy of Race, right? In 1942, some 51 years before Cornel West published Race Matters. He is also regarded as the author of UNESCO's 1950 Statement on Race, although he only served as the principal author of that document. And that statement is the original treatise, so far as I've been able to determine, that argues that race is not a valid biological concept, that all human beings are one species. But when I turned up Montagu's article, I suddenly got nervous. Oh God, someone has already written about this and stolen my thunder. But it was after I read the article that I was convinced maybe I'm still onto something. Montagu takes a 1950s anthropologist's view, and to make his argument that culture is a matter of time binding, quotes contemporaries in anthropology such as Firth, and here's Firth's definition of culture. Culture emphasizes the component of accumulated resources, immaterial as well as material, which the people inherit, employ, transmute, add to, and transmit. Cluckhorn, and I quote, "The general abstract notion of culture serves to remind us that we cannot explain acts solely in terms of the biological properties of the people concerned, past experience and the immediate situation. The past experience of other men in the form of culture enters into almost every event." Herskowitz, "Culture includes all the elements in man's nature, in man's mature endowment that he has acquired from his group by conscious learning or, on a somewhat different level, by a conditioning process." And finally, the aptly named White, and I quote, "Culture is passed down from one generation to another, or it may be borrowed freely by one tribe from another." As a passing point of emphasis, you may have caught the sexist language in both Cluckhorn and Herskowitz definitions. I also, unfortunately, don't have time to address here the implications of cultural appropriation in White's point about borrowing freely from other tribes. But anyway, Montagu goes on to immediately show his hand in the paragraph that follows all of these definitions, when he writes, "Compare with these definitions Korzybski's definition of culture or civilization in the 1921 Manhood of Humanity." And he cites that definition, and this is Korzybski. "Civilization as a process is the process of binding time. Progress is made by the fact that each generation adds to the material and spiritual wealth which it inherits. Past achievements, the fruit of bygone time, thus live in the present, are augmented in the present, and transmitted to the future. The process goes on. Time, the essential element, is so involved that though it increases arithmetically, its fruit, civilization, advances geometrically." So it's here that the question arises, and honestly, I can't believe I'm taking on Montagu, right? Culture or civilization, as though they mean the same thing? And this from the man who, in man's most dangerous myth, The Fallacy of Race, sexist language once again there, advocated for the term ethnic groups or mixed ethnic groups instead of races or subspecies. His argument from start to finish seems, at its center, to articulate and perpetuate a white, male, and European predisposition, if not a colonialist predisposition, toward culture. So it's kind of funny, well, it's interesting that, I also happened to go back during my research to discover or to remember that Michel Foucault published the first work that made his reputation, Mental Illness and Psychology, back in 1954. And, we began to learn in the 1950s, to borrow from the title of Tom Friedman's book, that the world is flat, or at least that we ought to recognize and regard it as flat, that culture is horizontal, and that it is one of the supreme intellectual achievements of our age to regard it in this way. I don't think I'm going out on a limb if I say that most people still do not do so. Witness the white supremacists coming out of their basements and out from under their rocks in an age of Donald Trump. But culture is not vertical with respect to hierarchy and hegemony. That is to say, with respect to the traditional idea that there is a dominant culture of power that is, at least in this country, white, male, and Western European, and that all other cultures are satellite cultures circling around it, or that reside beneath it and under its boot. Or that they are, and I've always loathed this word, subcultures. In addition, culture is not just vertical in or as the direct lineage of our own time binding coming down to us from people who were or are somewhat like us. So in other words, I'm making two distinct arguments here. The first is that Korzybski did not tend to think of, and thus regard culture, as anything other than what would expect from a white European male of his time. Such regard was not part of his milieu. And the contemporary thinking about culture that I'm criticizing as lacking in citing Montague's article, I might also say begins with his book, Man's Most Dangerous Myth. Right? It certainly begins to take hold with the publication of UNESCO's statement on race in the very year Korzybski died. I'll also note that the statement on race originally met with much resistance and criticism, and I'll add that world events such as the Armenian genocide of the 1920s, the Holocaust, and the civil rights movement beginning in the United States in the 1950s all obviously also contributed to the turning of the tide. My second argument is to resituate then and understand culture as space-bound, as a matter of space binding. We live on a planet comprised of myriad cultures of people. For those of us who live here in the US, our own country is a proverbial melting pot of cultures, the product of the diaspora of all manner of peoples who come here and assimilate, but who also do not assimilate to varying extents and should not fully do so. And just in the way that media ecologists refer to media as environments in which we live, not to mention as cultures, culture is an environment in which we live. We daily negotiate and need to negotiate, and need to constantly renegotiate the cultures of peoples with whom we live and work. Thus, while we certainly learn about culture from our experience through time as we live our lives, and for those of us who still read, as we read about the lessons in learning about culture beginning with Vico, but really taking off in the middle of the 20th century, we also learn in the moment. We learn by traveling and encountering others, by a meeting of hearts and minds and souls, and by trying to cross the bridge and connect to and learn about people from cultures other than our own. And while I said just a few minutes ago that this mission of cultural studies is one of the supreme intellectual achievements of our time, I might also argue that it has been to a great extent a failure. For while it brings all cultures onto a level plane so that we might regard others' contributions as equal and equally important, the result has mostly been to ensilo people into realms of discourse where they mostly talk to and among themselves. We still do not cross these bridges enough. And so in the end, let me just say this. There's a slippery word in Korzybski's definition of time binding as I presented it at the outset. That time binding is about how we humans adapt to our environment through our awareness and control of space and time. We tend to focus on and privilege and talk and write much more about the time part of this equation, the carrying down of knowledge over time, than we acknowledge and address his passing mention in that definition of space. Well, did he include that word deliberately to remind us that we are animals? Was it a hedge against the hardening of his categories? Or did he add the word because he was actually missing something? I invite you to tell me. Thank you.